All right. Hello, folks. Today we're talking about non-food reinforcers. Last week we talked about food reinforcers and some considerations when using them and what our big Facebook group voted for in terms of their favorite. Today we're going to be talking about same kind of stuff, but with non-food reinforcers. If you have any questions today, during the presentation, go ahead and put them under the video wherever you're watching this. All right, so some of this is review from last week, but for those of you who didn't watch that one, I wanted to cover this again. Why are we talking about reinforcers? Remember the definition of a positive reinforcer, which is what we're talking about today. We're not talking about negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcer is something that when gained following a behavior increases or maintains likelihood of that behavior in the future. So your dog sits, you give them a treat, they're more likely to sit again in the future when you ask them to. There are conditioned and unconditioned reinforcers. Most of the time, when we're using food, or today we're going to be talking about like play and toys, a lot of those things are likely unconditioned reinforcers. In other words, they're things that the dog didn't have to learn were reinforcing. They just, without any learning or conditioning, they act as reinforcers. But there are some, we'll talk about at least one thing today that may well be a conditioned reinforcer for many dogs. That means that the stimulus is reinforcing because it has been paired in the past with a primary reinforcer for something like food or something the dog likes, sort of without having to learn to like it. And what do you use reinforcers for? Teaching new behaviors is probably what a lot of us are most familiar with. You go to dog training class, you get your treat bag, teach new behaviors. But remember, we can also use our reinforcers to improve performance, maintain an existing behavior. Remember, you can't just stop reinforcing. If you want a behavior to persist, you have to find a way for it to be reinforced, at least at some rate, long term. And you can even use reinforcers to kind of refine a behavior in terms of where and when the dog does it. All right, choosing reinforcers. So how do you choose what to use when you're going to train your dog? These are some of the general considerations we talked about last week as well. Does it fit into the context in which you need to train? Is it something you can use and can use rather easily in your training setup? Does it have any negative health effects that might affect how much of it you can use? Is it expensive? Is it convenient or inconvenient for you to like have with you to deliver to the dog? Is it something the dog gets tired of quickly? Some of you may have had this happen when you give your dog a new toy or you have a new treat. It's super popular in the beginning, and then after a while, your dog's like, meh, I already had that today. And likely your dog this will happen for your dog at different rates for different reinforcers. So some things will be good for much longer, and other things, you try it for like one training session, the dog's already getting sick of it. Does the reinforcer facilitate training or does it get in the way? And we'll talk about a couple examples of that. And can you control access? So of course, if you're going to use something to reinforce behavior you like, you have to be able to provide it to the dog contingent on a behavior. So if you can't kind of control when it's available, it's hard to use as a reinforcer. All right, so why are we spending some time on non-food reinforcers today? There's so many examples, and non-food reinforcers, I think, are kind of fun to think about in dog training. So many of us in positive reinforcement dog training use food a lot for a lot of good reasons. But there's so many creative and very individualized reinforcers other than food that many dogs would work for. So some examples that are kind of commonly used are toys, playing with toys, sniffing, or access to sniffing spots, interactive play with their person, chasing their person or being chased, which could count as interactive play, or chasing critters, perhaps, petting, kind of attention, Some of the pros, of course, is that there are none of these contain calories. So if you're trying to watch your dog's intake, that's one advantage non-food reinforcers have over treats. For some dogs, they can be more reinforcing, more valuable than food, at least in some contexts. So some of you may have dogs that, food is the be all end all, and that's, nothing can compete ever with that. And in some ways that makes training easier. But there are plenty of dogs, especially those of you who have dogs who sometimes, they don't care about treats, or they ignore the treats. There's something else maybe we can use in those situations that the dog's telling you might be more reinforcing than food. There are at least some problem behaviors that are maintained by reinforcers that can be simulated by like play or chasing a toy or tugging on a tug toy. If you think about problem behaviors like chasing stuff that you don't want your dog to chase, jumping up, tugging on the leash, there are ways that perhaps you could use reinforcers that are similar to chasing a critter, but to reinforce behavior you like better. And of course, you do get some exercise and enrichment out of a lot of these reinforcers, so you kind of get to double dip a little bit there. All right, some downsides of non-food reinforcers. Just like with food, there could always be some kind of health concern for any particular dog, for any particular reinforcer. If you're doing a lot of repetitive, sort of athletic activity with your dog, it's possible they could sustain some kind of injury. Non-food reinforcers are not always convenient to use, depending on your training setup. They can take quite a bit longer to deliver. If you think about how quick it is to pop a treat into your dog's mouth versus even doing one sort of repetition of fetch or something, it takes longer. That means your training reps will have to be spaced farther apart in time. Some reinforcers, and same thing with food though, some like toy or play reinforcers can end up prompting some behaviors that you weren't going for, but it's kind of a side effect of that toy or that activity. Excuse me. And your dog, if you're doing stuff that's pretty high effort, your dog could physically tire quickly, which might limit how long you can train using these reinforcers. All right, so let's quickly go through these considerations, these general considerations with non-food reinforcers in mind. So these are considerations when you're deciding whether to use a non-food reinforcer or a particular non-food reinforcer. Does it fit your training context? Does it pose any health risks? Is it expensive? Is it convenient? Does your dog tire of it? Does it work well with your training or not? And can you control it? So does it fit in your training context? A lot of these non-food reinforcers, if you're using play or toys, kind of need a lot of space. If you imagine throwing a ball, using a flirt pole, a frisbee, like in this photo, running, anything that involves running, you'll need some freedom of movement and some space to move in for it to be a viable reinforcer for your training. And sometimes you don't have that, either because you're in a small space or your dog has to be on a 6-foot leash and it's hard for them to be able to move freely. Another thing that you always need to think about for any of these reinforcers is, are you going to have this reinforcer available sort of at the end of training when you're using whatever behavior it is you're working on in real life? So if you're using a toy as a reinforcer, are you going to generally have that available or not so much? If you're not going to, then it might be better to think about something you are likely to be able to use in day-to-day work. All right, health effects of non-food reinforcers. Like I mentioned, like sports types injuries, dogs doing a lot of high impact activities could result in an injury. If you live in a place where it gets pretty hot, you really can't safely do a ton of things like fetch at certain times of the day without the dog risking overheating. There may be dangers in the environment that you put your dog at higher risk of encountering if you for some of these behaviors. So for instance, if you're using sniffing or access to sniffing, as a reinforcer and you are walking your dog in an area with a lot of foxtails, which those of you in the east side of the country don't have to worry about, but West Coasters, you know that foxtails are they're up right now and they'll be dry and ready to send your dog to the vet in the next month probably. So if you're telling your dog to sniff, would they be more likely to inhale a foxtail and end up at the vet, or find some kind of garbage and eat it? Those are things to keep in mind depending on where you're walking. Cost. The nice thing about kind of play and toys is that they're either free or pretty low cost most of the time. So that's an upside. Convenience, however, can be sometimes non-food reinforcers are kind of inconvenient. Like if you're using a toy, do you have to carry it with you on walks? Always have it with you. You have to remember to have it. And then can you carry it without, making it hard for you to also hold on to your leash, and maybe you have a treat bag and you're also using treats. So they can be inconvenient sometimes. Does your dog get tired quickly of it? We have kind of two ways that come to mind when it comes to things like play and toys, in ways your dog could get tired of it. One is just getting physically tired. That could limit your training session if your dog just gets physically tired, which is kind of different from just getting bored of the reinforcer, where they kind of satiate on it. It's just not that interesting anymore. Does it facilitate or disrupt training? I have one little example in a video at the end of the slides here. I'll show you of a disruptive toy reinforcer. Toys and play, this stuff is almost always going to take longer for the dog to kind of consume that reinforcer than it would it would take them longer to consume a toy or play type reinforcer than a treat. And so it is likely, not always, but probably often likely to slow down the pace of your training, like how many repetitions you can do per minute. And that might matter, might not. And again, you might prompt undesirable behaviors that are kind of at odds with what you're trying to teach your dog. And we talked about that last week, about how the same can be true of food. You can end up with a dog who's kind of fixated on the food, stares at the food, tries to grab the food. Doesn't mean you can't use food, but those are just things then you have to work around. Can you control access? If you're using a toy or yourself as the entertainment, then sure, you can control access. Things like sniffing or something in the environment, your dog probably has to be on leash for you to be able to keep them from accessing that reinforcer freely. All right, so we surveyed our big our support group. Remember, these are folks dealing with fear and aggression. And I asked them, what are your favorite non-food reinforcers? If I pose the same question to a dog sports group, like people doing agility or something, you would probably get different answers. So just keep that in mind. So for folks in our group, fear and aggression, what were their top non-food reinforcers they liked the best? So number one was praise, which I have to say surprised me a little bit. But by a huge margin, actually, praise was the most preferred non-food reinforcer. Fetch was next. Tug, which is popular with many dogs. Petting. So if your dog loves petting, that can be a good one. And then interactive play with you that doesn't involve toys. So like running together, chasing each other, that kind of thing. I'd love to hear if you use any of these or have different ideas. I'd love to hear about them. Just pop them in the comments. This is such a rich area for where you can really diversify the reinforcers used in your training. So like I did last week, I made a little table here of those top 5, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yep, non-food reinforcers that the group liked, and put a few of the considerations across the top. So this portable thing has to do with the convenience of the reinforcer, the space. Does it take up only a little space? That's kind of, does it fit part of fitting your training context? Not tiring. So we need to know if it's something that the dogs might satiate on or tire of quickly or not. And quick, can you, will it allow you to train quickly, or will you have some lag between your reps? So the nice thing is that most of these are portable. Obviously, things like praise, petting, and interactive play only require you, right? So you've always got that in your pocket, so to speak. But fetch and tug, or if you use a small toy, it's also pretty portable. So pretty convenient to take with you. Space is a different story. Fetch and anything that involves running is going to require more space and more freedom of movement. Tug you can usually do in kind of a small area because the dog's holding on to the toy that you're holding on to, so you're staying pretty close together. Petting and praise obviously don't require any real movement on the dog's part. Not tiring, or praise and petting, probably not that tiring. Everything else is likely to be physically tiring to some degree. And it might look like I'm saying that's a con here because there are no green check marks, but obviously some of you might be pretty happy about a reinforcer that is also tiring to your dog, because your dog might be hard to tire out. So don't take that as a negative, but it's just something to know as you go into your training session. And then, is it quick or not? Praise and petting can be sort of deployed and delivered really quickly. Fetch, tug, and a chase game are going to take longer until sort of you can stop that and then start the next rep. Especially something like fetch might be the toughest to make quick because you throw the toy, they go get it, then you have to get the toy back from your dog before you can do the next repetition. This is my reminder to talk about praise that is kind of an interesting one. The other 4 reinforcers on this table are probably primary or unconditioned reinforcers. Not for sure and not for all dogs, but my guess is most dogs for whom fetch would work as a reinforcer, just like fetch. Like you throw a ball and they right away, without having to learn about it, wanted to chase it. And maybe wanted to bring it back if you're lucky. Same thing with tug. A lot of dogs just, as young puppies, they already like tugging on stuff. Petting, same thing. Chasing stuff. A lot of dogs, they don't need to learn that chasing stuff is fun. It just is reinforcing. It's fun. But praise is kind of stands out amongst these 5. And it's interesting because it could be, for any individual dog, we don't know if it's unconditioned or conditioned in terms of a reinforcer. So is it sort of naturally, for lack of a better word, reinforcing to the dog, or is it reinforcing because the dog has learned that praise predicts other stuff, like other primary reinforcers? My guess is that for many dogs, praise is a conditioned reinforcer because we might say things like, "Oh, you're such a good boy," before we, give some ear scratches or give a treat or whatever. So that means that the dog has learned that praise predicts good stuff. And so the reinforcing sort of property of praise is a learned thing. The other interesting thing about praise is that it's probably, for a lot of dogs, again, this is a guess, but my guess would be it's probably a generalized conditioned reinforcer, which means that it's been paired with lots of different reinforcers in the past, sometimes food, sometimes attention, sometimes play, that might actually make it a more powerful reinforcer for some dogs who have had a strong sort of history of praise being conditioned to a lot of different reinforcers. That means that you might get more sort of mileage out of it, because even if the dog isn't hungry, so the praise predicting food, if praise only predicted food, it might not be that effective. Because praise has predicted lots of different stuff in the past, it could still work on a dog who's, say, satiated on one or more common reinforcers. You still have to, you can't just never follow praise with anything ever again and expect it to keep working if it is a conditioned reinforcer, but there's little risk of that. Most of us talk to our dogs, say nice things to them all day, and they get a lot of good stuff throughout the day. I noticed that my 2 boy dogs, now that I have 2 boy dogs, when I say, "Oh, good boy," both of my male dogs have now, that's become a conditioned reinforcer, and they both whip around and come over expecting food or attention from me. It's actually a little more reliable than some other cues I have. So that's interesting. Does anyone have a dog who for sure will work for praise? Like they find it reinforcing, or they you know for sure they won't work for praise. So another thing I should point out is that, most of you probably know this already, but just because you do something after your dog does a behavior you like, and you're doing it to try to reinforce that behavior, doesn't mean that thing actually functioned as a reinforcer. So, I can tell my dog good boy after he say does a recall or something, but if recall doesn't get stronger, doesn't either, or at least maintain in the future, then that wasn't a reinforcer despite my intentions. So alas, our intentions don't matter very much. The dog will tell us whether or not something was reinforcing. And if you think about it, it's the same way with punishers. How many of us, try to scold or say no? I know all you guys out there using positive reinforcement try not to scold, but it's very common practice for people to say no, stop that, to a dog, and it might stop it in the moment, whatever it is they're doing. But if that behavior doesn't decrease in the future, that didn't serve as punishment. Saying no or whatever didn't serve as punishment. It was, however, reinforced for you because the dog stopped that behavior. So you will probably scold in the future if you've had that experience. All right. If you have any questions about non-food reinforcers, go ahead and put them in the comments. I'm going to show this little video real quick of a few examples of our dogs, our client dogs, I think mostly, and our trainers using non-food reinforcers. Some of you may have seen this one already. I've used it in some other videos. Little Bea here is working on polite leash walking and also looking at her handler on cue. And one reinforcer we've used with her is running up a tree where she has seen squirrels in the past. And so you'll see she gets sort of up the tree, and then Rachel will ask for attention again. Okay, go ahead. Now, can anyone tell me what potentially unwanted behavior that this reinforcer could sort of end up causing? I don't know if you saw that. Anytime you're using a behavior where the reinforcer is going to be, well, basically wherever the reinforcer is going to be kind of collected by the dog, a lot of times the dog will, in anticipation, move in that direction, which may or may not help your training cause. So in this case, it's not that helpful. If what you want is for the dog to walk alongside you, you can see how she's edging, Bea's like edging backward toward the, let me go back, toward the tree in anticipation of getting to go up the tree. See here? I mean, it worked fine, but you can see that could become a problem depending on what you needed from your training. Okay, here's an example of using access to a sniffing spot for attention. So Melissa just asked Pepper to look at her and then directed her over to sniff that tree. Now, sniffing can be a tough one to use effectively unless you know areas where your dog is likely to actually want to sniff. Because if your dog isn't interested in sniffing an area, then giving them access to that area to sniff isn't likely to serve as a reinforcer. So it's nice if you can identify areas that you are pretty sure your dog will want to explore. All right, here's a toy example. I believe this is showing a situation in which the toy reinforcer, the use of the toy, is actually a bit disruptive to training. It's working against Rachel here. So Rachel is working on polite leash walking out the front door for a dog who used to just bolt out the front door. And some of you may enjoy that experience with your dogs. And she has a ball. Coco loves toys. So she's going to try to use a mini game of fetch. But you'll see she gets her toy out, squeaky ball. Oh boy. But as you can see, it bounced out of range. And so even though she was trying to reinforce polite leash walking on a loose leash, she ended up with the dog pulling to try to get the ball. Now here she's going to correct her delivery a little bit. Doesn't mean you can't use the ball, but she's going to bounce it back toward where, to set up her next rep, back toward the door, and also ran to keep up with Coco so the leash didn't tighten. Here's a way to use a ball that's a little more under your control. Here, Rachel has tied her squeaky ball to the end of a flirt pole, kind of like a giant cat wand toy, for those of you not familiar. And she's in a big open area where Coco can see triggers from a distance. And she's trying to reinforce, sorry. Pancake is done at the vet is the messages I'm getting. Many messages. So she's going to reinforce Coco for looking away from the trigger and at her by giving her some playtime with her favorite ball on the end of the flirt pole. But you can see, you play a little bit, this does take some time. And in this situation, this works fine because she's only asking for that behavior, sorry about that, when she sees a trigger. So it doesn't matter that there's a long lag, that the collecting that reinforcer of play takes a while, because it might be a while till the next trigger shows up anyway. But sometimes that would be a problem. Okay. So just as a reminder, free stuff. More info on our blog, Instagram, YouTube channel, Facebook page, support group, and we now have that page on our website where our free resources are compiled, our webinars and stuff like that. The extension there is free/resources or -resources. All right, folks, I hope that was helpful. I'd love to hear if any of you try some non-food reinforcers in the next week and either have great success or not so much. Still like to hear about it. And we'll see you online. Next week, I'll be actually on vacation, so there will be no video next week, but I'll be back the week after. All right, everybody, have a wonderful week.